Chapter 23 Crisis of Catechetical Year 0002, August 19th. It was as he was getting off the elevator into the lobby with Connolly that Cloud heard it. One of the two businessmen that stepped past them to enter the elevator was saying loudly,
"Yeah, Denzel's going to be 2 years old in December."
Cloud whirled, catching just a brief glimpse of a sandy-haired man as the doors slid closed. It was enough for him to see the similarities in the shape of the eyes, in the face and colouring that was so achingly familiar that it caused a lump to rise in his throat.
"Hey, Cloud, you okay?"
Connolly's voice and the hesitant hand on his arm made him start, and he jerked away before he could stop himself. He stared blankly at Connolly, lost in a wave of memory, of a hopeful voice eagerly wanting to hear about his travels, of tired, sick eyes that begged him to stay, of hands that were too small, too weak, but that still managed to hang on to him tighter than anything else ever had. He stepped back again when Connolly moved, shaking his head. He felt absolutely claustrophobic, unable to stay still, and he wanted more than anything else to get away, because he couldn't have. He began, one hand coming up to grip at his bangs in a too tight grip, before he gave up. Whirling, he strode across the lobby, tuning out Connolly's startled cry, the questions from the receptionist, the whispers from the observers, as he all but ran out of the building. Denzel is... It hurt too much to think. He tried to push the memories back. He'd already come to terms with those he'd lost, or at least he thought he had. But the stark reminder that Denzel was out there now, alive and well with his parents, and not Cloud's, caused his chest to tighten, and he could feel the sting of tears welling in his eyes. They didn't fall, but the emotions ripped at his heart as if they were fresh wounds. Everything passed by in a blur, and it was only when the loud, distinct sound of the train whistle sounded across the station that he came back to himself. He'd fled down to the slums in an unconscious move, his feet carrying him towards a source of comfort, while his mind had fought against the stabbing pain of hurt, lost longing. He froze in a moment of indecision, wanting to continue his path to see Aerith, but also feeling a flood of guilt for wanting that comfort when things between them hadn't been fixed either. This was the first time he'd come down to the slums since that disastrous night. There was a feeling of pressure, of the plate pressing down and the air pressing in, and Cloud felt fragile, like he'd break if he didn't get away, didn't get out. Only he couldn't leave, and there was no way out, no way to return to those he loved and missed. It wasn't a conscious decision for him to start moving again. He passed like a ghost through Sector 7, following the ever-familiar path through the dingy streets until he was staring up at Aerith's church. It would always hold that distinction for him, of being safety, of being home, of comfort and healing and familiarity, no matter who occupied it or how abandoned it became. As the building came into view, his footsteps slowed, dragging against the ground until he stopped a few feet away. The doors had been repaired. He'd meant to do that himself, but hadn't found the time to come down. No, he'd been afraid of coming down. That he'd do something or say something that would alienate Aerith entirely, or maybe that he'd somehow make it worse between Aerith and Zack. As far as he knew, They hadn't spoken since she told them to leave her alone. And now Cloud was here at her door, expecting what, he didn't know. It wasn't like she would know Denzel, or what he'd meant to Cloud. That didn't stop the longing. Inside he knew Aerith would be tending her flowers, wearing the white dress she favoured in this time, though her hair would be pulled back by the ribbon Zack had gifted to her. He wanted to see her, but his feet wouldn't move him forward the last few steps. One leaf of the doors moved, and Aerith leaned out of the gap, peeking around the doors at him. "Cloud?" she asked, voice soft, concerned. "Are you all right?" The words struck him, an echo of Connolly's concern from earlier, and Cloud flinched. All he did was worry people. It shouldn't affect him this strongly. He should be happy that Denzel was alive and with his parents. He wasn't, though. He hunched forward and clenched his fists as he tried to calm down. "Sorry," he said, voice thin and tight. "I didn't mean—" Aerith stepped all the way out onto the stairs, her brows knit with worry. She regarded him for a few seconds longer before stepping down the stairs to him and immediately engulfing him in a hug. "What happened?" A shudder ran down Cloud's back before he reached around and pulled her tightly to him, burying his face in her hair. The smell of her, of the flowers she loved and the sunlight they grew in, flowed over him and helped calm his racing heart. She'd always forgive him, wouldn't she? Even when he was being foolish, Aerith never held it against him. He had said as much to Zack, but it was always harder to believe for himself. "There was a child," he began, "when—" He halted, not knowing what he wanted to say or how to convey the feelings twisting inside his heart. "There was sickness, and he came to me here. I thought at the time Aerith had sent him to me to help him. I just miss him." She made a low, soft sound and pulled him back from his tight embrace to take one of his hands. "Come sit with me," she murmured, tugging him back towards the church. He followed without protest, docilely letting her guide him to sit on the steps where she pulled him to rest against her side. Her fingers carded through his hair, much like he'd done for her months ago in the park. Sinking against her, he closed his eyes and wound his arms around her waist, just holding her loosely and letting her heat sink into him. "His parents were killed," he said softly, feeling vaguely detached as he opened his eyes to stare blankly ahead. "But here, it won't happen. It was a shock to realize. I never thought—" He made a low sound in his throat. "I'm selfish." He wanted Denzel to be his, but here he had parents and would grow up without ever knowing Cloud even existed. "You are not," Aerith said firmly, resting her cheek against the crown of his head. "It's not selfish to want to be happy." Wasn't it? It seemed like his happiness was always at the cost of someone else. Or maybe it was just that happiness was always so fleeting. He sighed, feeling the tickle of her hair against his nose. Or maybe he should stop letting his thoughts spiral down the worst scenario path. Finding out about Denzel so unexpectedly had hurt, yes, but it was more the suddenness. He hadn't been prepared to face these kind of thoughts today. Aerith's steadfast presence was chasing away those demons, leaving him with the vague guilt that it had taken a mental breakdown to get him to come to see her again. "I keep messing up," he muttered. "With Zack? With her? Maybe even with Sephiroth. How could he not be? He couldn't even keep from hurting his friends.
So fix it.
He let out a choked laugh.
Can I? Will you let me?
Hadn't she already?
Of course.
It was an answer that responded to both questions. Pushing back, Cloud loosened his hold, sliding his hands around to capture hers in his.
I'm sorry for not telling you sooner.
I forgive you, she said without missing a beat. Her lips quirked into a small smile. It was a big secret. Just make sure you come visit sooner next time, or I might just stay mad longer. She studied his face a moment, then pushed gently. Do you want to tell me about him?
Not now. Maybe one day.
Cloud still felt too raw to do so. Right now, the thought of saying out loud the painful truth about how much he'd missed his old life made his heart clench and his hands shake. He needed to anchor himself to the now. Well, she said with a huff, just make sure you do keep that promise. That did make him smile.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, you! The reprimand was accompanied by her thumping her hand against his chest. Then, since we're doing another round of not talking about this, thank you very much, tell me what you've been up to. She wrinkled her nose as she plucked at his uniform, and he could see the dark worry cloud her eyes.
I'd rather,
he said, capturing her hand in his to stop its wandering.
You tell me about you. How have you been doing, Aerith?
How have you been taking the news that we lied to you? That Zack was only trying to protect you? Will you forgive him as easily as you did me? He couldn't voice these thoughts, though. She gave him a, I see what you did there look, but relented.
My mother wants to kick you for introducing me to Wall Market, but I think she likes the pastries I bring back too much to argue.
He listened as she talked, about her adventures in the other sectors and visiting Gibbs' family shop, about how one day she came back to find the doors repaired and Sing hanging around for a parting word, though he made no move against her, and that made Cloud's hackles stand on end, even if there was nothing he could do about it now, about how her garden was growing. The longer they talked, the more grounded Cloud felt. A sound made him jerk his head up, and Aerith cut off abruptly, breaking the bubble their conversation had been wrapped in. From around the bend in the road, two figures emerged, and Cloud rose to his feet in surprise. Connolly shuffled forward hesitantly, and clinging to his hand was the small form of Violet.
We're not, interrupting anything?
He asked apprehensively, looking from Cloud to Aerith and back. Violet broke free of his grip to run forward at Cloud, burying her face in his stomach as her arms wrapped tightly around his waist.
Violet,
Cloud said softly, resting one hand on her back. She just squeezed him tighter, and he let her be for the moment. Looking up at Connolly, he nodded reassuringly.
Sorry for running off. How did you know where I went?
Connolly shrugged and ducked his head self-consciously.
Second told me to check down here.
Cloud nodded absently, turning to reach a hand out and help Aerith back to her feet.
That was probably Kunzel.
Once she was steady, he turned back to Connolly, who shuffled forward a few more steps, still seemingly unsure of his welcome.
He's a friend. A good one?
Connolly asked, glancing over his shoulder nervously.
I trust him.
Cloud replied simply. Violet's grip had loosened somewhat, and he tugged her gently away so he could kneel in front of her.
Violet, what are you doing here alone? Where are your friends?
I'm not alone, she mumbled, rubbing at red-rimmed eyes. Mr. Connolly brought me here. You didn't stop. Guilt wrenched in his gut. He hadn't noticed her in his emotional state. Giving Connolly a thankful look, he pressed gently again.
I'm sorry. What about your friends? Where's Poppy?
Large tears began dripping down her face, and with a wail she threw her arms around his neck, sobbing into his collar. Surprised and dismayed, he wrapped her in a hug and looked over at Aerith for help. He received a sympathetic smile in return as Aerith nodded towards the doors into the church. Raising to his feet, Cloud lifted the crying girl into his arms as he turned to make his way inside. Behind him, he heard Aerith speaking to Connolly.
You can come too. I don't think... It's fine, come on! Connolly, was it? I'm Aerith.
Inside the church, Cloud felt more of the tension lift from his shoulders, despite his worry over Violet. The muted sunlight, filtered through the broken ceiling, shone off the bright, bobbing heads of the flowers, and he headed for them without pause. 2 sets of footsteps indicated Aerith had been successful in getting Connolly to follow, though he wasn't surprised. He sat on the edge of the garden and let his legs dangle over the side, careful, as always, of the fragile plants. They were resilient, he knew, but Aerith's ire at carelessness wasn't something to be taken lightly. He settled Violet in his lap as he waited for her sobs to slow, absently rubbing her back with one hand as he turned to greet Aerith's approach. Connolly a few steps behind her.
Wow.
The hushed comment carried easily in the open space of the church. Connolly's eyes were locked on the flower garden, a touch of awe on his face.
I haven't seen this many flowers since I moved to Midgar.
Miss Aerith takes good care of them, Violet piped up unexpectedly. Her voice was still thick with tears, but she'd calmed down. Cloud was more surprised that she'd spoken at all. She tended to be the quiet one of her group of friends, her shyness only mitigated once she became comfortable around people.
Wow,
Connolly echoed, as Aerith stepped lightly forward to crouch next to Cloud.
Feeling better?
She asked, reaching out to smooth Violet's hair back from her teary eyes. Cloud felt her nod against him, though she seemed in no hurry to move away.
Did something happen with Poppy?
He asked. That had been what set her off, and it worried him that something had happened to the outgoing redhead. She's sick, was the muffled reply. Aerith frowned.
Is that why you 3 haven't come visiting recently?
I thought... She shook her head and looked towards Cloud.
How long?
He asked. Aerith pressed a finger to her chin as she thought. I haven't seen them in about a week or 2, I think. She's really sick, Violet said, pushing away from Cloud to give him a distressed look. And I can't go and see her anymore. Her sister says she needs rest, but it's been days. Her voice trailed off into the merest whisper at the end of her outburst, and she leaned back into Cloud. Aerith's mouth pinched with worry. She shot Cloud a look he couldn't quite decipher. I have heard there's been a sickness making its way through the slums recently. A tendril of unease worked its way down Cloud's back. While he knew there was no way for it to be the same, his thoughts wandered to the long misery the geostigma sickness had brought upon the planet. He couldn't help it, what with Denzel on his mind. Sighing, he spent a few moments staring into space, lost in thought. He'd spent months, long, fruitless months, researching illnesses in his search for something to ease the geostigma virus. It hadn't been a normal sickness, but something born of Sephiroth's revenge against the planet. Maybe now, though, he could find some use for that knowledge that seemed so useless before.
Violet, can you take me to Poppy's house?
We can all go. I'd like to see how she's doing, Aerith said firmly, pushing herself to her feet. "And if there's anything I can do to help." She walked over to the wall where her staff was resting, the cure materia glinting in its slot. Cloud rose to his feet, with Violet still in his arms. Connolly looked between the two, obviously torn, so Cloud snagged his arm as he passed to pull him along.
"Come on."
I can't just..." Connolly stuttered as Cloud dragged him relentlessly along. He finally gave in with a sigh, falling into step beside Cloud.
"Okay, fine. I don't know what you need me for, though."
"I don't," Cloud said simply.
"But I want you to come." "Okay,"
Connolly repeated, shaking his head and giving a rueful grin.
"That's our Cloud,"
Aerith said with a hum. "Tactless, but sweet."
"Was it?"
Cloud asked, blinking at her in surprise. He hadn't meant it to be. Violet giggled from his shoulder, and he let out a quiet huff.
"Sorry. He used to be worse,"
Connolly said.
"if you can believe it." "Oh dear,"
Aerith said, laughter in her voice. They were halfway through the area between Sector 5 and 6 when a hole eater came skittering over the pile of debris, clicking and warbling as it charged their small group. Cloud stepped back with Violet, though he made no move to attack when he saw Aerith move out of the corner of his eye. Connolly had started badly, fumbling for his rifle that was strung on his back, but he never got the chance to draw it before Aerith stepped in, slamming her rod against the monster's side, sending it tumbling end over end back the way it came. She turned, tilting her chin up in challenge, but Cloud just nodded in approval. Connolly was too busy gaping, so Cloud reached out to tug him into motion again.
"You've gotten much better,"
he praised as he came level with her.
"I've been working hard."
Her smile was proud, as was the set of her shoulders.
"You and Zack worry too much."
His stomach dropped a bit at the reminder. He still hadn't explained it all to her, everything about his past, and her not-to-be future.
"I know,"
he said, not meeting her eyes. "I'll keep up," she said, and it sounded like a vow.
"No, seriously, why do you need me?"
Connolly broke in, throwing up his hands. Violet shifted in Cloud's arms, pulling herself up so her mouth was right next to his ear. "I like him. He's funny." Her voice was so serious, and Cloud had to grin.
"Which way?"
he asked, in lieu of commenting on that. She pointed out the way, and he turned in that direction with a soft hum, the other two following. Soon enough they were turning down the cluttered pathways that led them in front of a small shack. It was leaning at a precarious angle, only held up by struts of wood to prop it up, and a sign on the door warned of the sickness inside. Letting Violet slide to the ground, Cloud pressed her small hand into Connolly's. He nodded at them to stay back for the moment. Stepping forward, he knocked against the worn wood with a sharp series of raps. There was shuffling from inside. Then a young woman's voice floated through the closed door.
"Who's there?"
"Friends," Cloud replied, frowning as the voice tickled at his memory.
"We heard you have a sick child."
There was a long pause of silence before the door opened a crack and a suspicious eye peered out. The girl, teenager, let out a wordless exclamation before abruptly pulling the door wider. Her body still blocked entry, but now he could see that this could only be Poppy's sister, as Violet had mentioned. It was also, he noted with an inward groan of inevitability, a much younger Jessie staring at him with unguarded suspicion. He tried to push back the memory of the last time he'd seen her, bloodied and broken before the plate had... He didn't think he'd managed to keep his distress off his face as Jessie narrowed her eyes at him and leaned against the doorframe. The forced casualness screamed caution and distrust, and also had the benefit of blocking the opening into the shack. Cloud took a steadying breath. Violet's tear-stained face and imploring eyes flashed through his mind. He wasn't prepared to meet another ghost of his past, but he'd do it for Violet and Poppy's sake.
"You a soldier?"
Jessie demanded, looking him up and down derisively.
"I'm a friend,"
he corrected, waving a hand back to gesture Connolly and Violet forward.
"We heard Poppy was sick."
"Say," she drawled, expression clearing,
"you're that pretty boy she's been going on about."
She studied his face for a moment, nodding to herself.
She wasn't lying. Didn't say you were a soldier, though.
Behind him, Aerith cleared her throat.
"How is Poppy doing?"
Jessie's gaze slid over to Aerith, then lit up.
"And you must be that flower lady."
Her shoulders relaxed, apparently more comfortable with the idea, now that Cloud wasn't here officially by Shinra.
"Poppy's... well, she's real sick. Didn't I tell you to keep away?"
The last bit was directed at Violet, who shrank into Connolly's side.
"I shouldn't even be talking to you guys."
"Cloud can help," Violet piped up, giving Cloud a look so full of trust that he resisted the urge to wince. Her faith in him was distressingly familiar. This time, however, he thought he could help. At Jessie's continued suspicion, he nodded slightly.
"I've researched sicknesses. I might be able to do something."
He trailed off with an uncomfortable shrug.
"Aerith is also adept at healing."
"If there's anything I can do, I want to help," Aerith murmured. "Poppy and her friends are frequent visitors of my garden. I'm fond of them." Jessie stared at them for a few more seconds before letting out an explosive breath.
"Fine, but don't blame me if you get sick too. And Violet has to stay out here. I've already heard of other kids who died when they got like this. I'm not letting it happen to you."
She wagged a finger in Violet's face. Violet released Connolly's hand and stepped back, frowning up at Jessie. "I'll go home. I'll visit when Poppy's better, because Cloud will make her better." Connolly said.
"Do you want me to walk you home?"
Hesitating, Violet looked up at each of them in turn before shaking her head, her black hair flying. "I'll be fine. You stay with your friends." She darted forward and hugged Connolly around the waist. "Thank you for taking me to Miss Aerith and Cloud." Without another word, she whirled and dashed away, leaving Connolly staring dumbstruck after her.
"Well, I'll be. She must really like you,"
Jessie said with a sharp grin. Connolly's ears went red.
"So you all coming in, or what?"
Tapping her foot, Jessie thrust the door open all the way, gesturing impatiently inside. As he passed her, Cloud nearly stopped entirely as he realized she was taller than he was by at least an inch. Normally he wouldn't think about it, but he hated it when he was reminded of how old he was now. It only aggravated the rawness he'd been fighting all day. The inside of the shack was as small as its outside had suggested. One side of it was covered in scattered bits of electronics, half-taken apart radios, and other unidentifiable pieces of equipment. The other side was taken up by a pallet, only Poppy's red hair visible under the pile of blankets. Next to her was another blanket Cloud assumed Jessie had been using, along with a bucket of water and an empty potion bottle. A harsh cough drew Cloud to the bedside immediately, and he tugged off his gloves as Poppy curled in on herself, her body racked with the paroxysms. Her skin was burning to the touch, and though she didn't wake, tears leaked out of her eyes from the painful spasms. Gently, he rolled her onto her stomach, beginning to methodically tap along her back in an effort to loosen some of the congestion in her chest. It took a few minutes, But Cloud heard her breathing begin to take an easier rhythm, and she stopped immediately convulsing in further coughs. It was only temporary relief, he knew. Sitting back, he became aware of Aerith at his side, watching his moves with quiet, contemplative eyes. She smiled up at him, leaning in to whisper, "I think I can ease her symptoms a bit with cure, but that won't solve it." He nodded, frowning as he scooped up the empty potion bottle. Turning to Jessie, he asked quietly,
"What kind of potion did you use?"
"Fever reducer. It was the best I could afford." Jessie's words were tinged with bitter pride, and she lifted her chin at him challengingly. He made no comment, just nodded and turned back around.
"Please,"
he said quietly to Aerith, touching her hand and nodding at the materia and the staff at her side. The fever was worryingly high still, but it was the cough that concerned him most. It was in her lungs, and he wasn't certain if it was simple congestion or caused by bacteria. The books he'd read had been vague on the surface differences, going into procedures where you would test the patient's saliva or the coating of the throat. It sounded sketchy to him. It was all he had to go on, however. He closed his eyes, recalling the endless pages of books and notes, making a mental list of anything he could think that would be useful. He felt more than heard Aerith begin to cast a spell, the soothing feeling of her magic filling the air around them. When she finished, she reached out and felt Poppy's forehead, nodding in relief at the more bearable temperature. Poppy had dropped into a deep sleep, finally able to relax now that she was free of the worst of her symptoms. Like Aerith said, however, the magic wouldn't last unless they could take care of the underlying cause.
"I need medicine,"
he murmured, sitting back on his heels.
"It should be available here."
"I don't have any more money," Jessie piped up. She was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, watching him intently. He shook his head.
"I can pay."
"I don't need your charity either," Jessie countered. He regarded her for a moment. He could understand pride in the right circumstances. He'd been victim of it himself many times, during his fight with the remnant Kadaj, and later against the other Sephiroth as well. He'd been relieved that his friends hadn't stepped in at the time. Even the other Zack had, his offer bolstering Cloud's spirit, but Cloud turned him down in order to face Sephiroth himself. He wouldn't have been able to move on if he hadn't. This, however, wasn't the same kind of fight. Her sister's life was on the line, and he wondered if she'd let her pride take away an opportunity to ease the pain. Jessie shifted uncomfortably in the face of his silence, and finally shoved away from the wall, clenching her fists by her side.
"Fine. It's the least Shinra could do for us."
She stomped to the other side of the room, sitting down and beginning to clatter noisily among the equipment.
"I'll go,"
Connolly said, breaking into the standoff. He'd been standing quietly by the doorway, trying to be as unobtrusive as possible.
"I'll stay and watch Poppy,"
Aerith said, pushing at Cloud's arm.
"You two go."
Cloud rose and made for the door. Jessie didn't look up from her tinkering, the fierce frown on her face not lessening in the slightest as she pointedly ignored him. Nodding at Connolly, Cloud followed him out the door, closing it softly behind them.
"Wool Market,"
he said, gesturing back down the road. Instead of moving, Connolly gave him a strange look.
"What?" "Wool Market will have more supplies,"
he elaborated. Shaking his head, Connolly sighed, running a hand through his hair.
"I have no idea what you're talking about. I thought we'd be going back up to the plates to get things."
Blinking, it occurred to Cloud that he had no idea if Connolly had been down to the slums before. It wasn't a common destination, even for soldiers. After all, it was aptly named, and there wasn't anything to be found in the slums that couldn't be gotten better, cleaner, and more conveniently on the plates. It made sense for people like Gibbs, who came from the slums, or Kunzel, and the way he had an ear everywhere, to be familiar with it.
Ah,
He said, rubbing the back of his neck tiredly.
You know the sectors, at least?
At Connolly's hesitant nod, he continued.
Sector 6 has a marketplace. I don't want to take the time to go up again right now. Oh, okay.
Connolly nodded in understanding, and this time he fell into step with Cloud as they retraced their path. Gravel crunched under their boots as they walked along. Cloud lost himself to his thoughts, recalling all he could on the myriad of medicinal cures he'd run across. He'd tried many on himself. Once he'd fallen to the geostigma sickness, but nothing had made any difference against the rage-fed disease. A phantom pain ran through his arm at the memory, and he rubbed at it absently. Mostly, though, there were a number of mixtures that would soothe Poppy's throat against the soreness, herbs whose scent would help ease the congestion in her lungs, potions that would keep the fever from burning her dry. How much liquids had she been able to keep down? He'd forgotten to ask Jessie, too distracted by her presence and Poppy's cough. When he returned, he'd find out. The sound of Connolly clearing his throat made Cloud look up, blinking.
You come down here often?
He asked, his gaze focused on the ground in front of him. He grinned weakly at Cloud, shrugging his gun a bit higher on his shoulder as he did so.
It seems like you get into everything that happens.
The sound of something skittering across a nearby heap of debris had Cloud looking over at it with a frown, but when nothing attacked, he dismissed it. They came out into the park, deserted at this hour. It was still too far from the safer central areas of the sector for people to frequent, even though it was technically part of Sector 6. Cloud paused near the play structure, memories of past conversations flitting through his mind.
Sickness isn't uncommon in the slums. With the living conditions, it's more surprising I haven't run across any cases before. That's not exactly what I meant,
Connolly said ruefully. He scuffed a boot in the dirt.
Just, does it seem like everything is out of control sometimes?
Humming lowly, Cloud tilted his head up at the thought.
Sometimes I wonder if I ever had control,
he admitted.
We can only do the best we can, right?
Nodding, Connolly sighed quietly.
Right, of course.
Silence fell between them, but Cloud waited patiently. It seemed that Connolly still had something on his mind that was bothering him.
Why did you run away? Earlier?
Connolly bit his lip after blurting that out, looking guiltily at Cloud through his messy bangs.
Denzel's going to be 2 this December.
Cloud went still, eyes unfocused as he remembered the bright cheer, the pride in the man's voice as he said it. The age would be about right, and Denzel had told Cloud once that his father used to work for Shinra Electric Company.
Just memories,
Cloud said quietly.
Bad ones? No, not bad.
He missed Denzel and Tifa, Marlene and the rest, but their memory would never be regretful for him.
Something reminded me of it unexpectedly.
Connolly frowned at him worriedly.
Are you still having problems remembering things?
Shaking his head, Cloud clouted Connolly on the shoulder.
I still haven't forgiven you for blurting that out at Zach, you know.
He chuckled as Connolly went red, then began walking again, finishing their journey across the playground.
Maybe I should start a journal?
He mused, only half serious. Jogging a few steps to catch up, Connolly said flatly,
I can't imagine that. No.
Cloud's quiet laugh was lost as they stepped into Wallmarket, the bustle and noise swallowing them easily in the flow of the crowds. The market, the commerce, drew people to it even in the poor community, so that the streets were always crowded at any hour. The daylight face of it was busier as men and women alike scurried along, going about their business with a single-minded determination. He stepped lightly through the milling throng, well used to its quirks by now. While there was some risk in buying goods down here, he was confident enough that he could determine the quality of what he needed. Word of his scuffle with Don Corneo's men had never died away completely, what with his frequenting the slums. So many of the shopkeepers were eager to make sure he got a fair bargain. It was somewhat annoying, but also convenient, so he let it be.
Wow!
Connolly's awe echoed his earlier tone from the church, and Cloud raised an eyebrow at him. Shrugging, Connolly had to hop backwards out of the way of an old woman who barreled by, uncaring of who she elbowed out of her way.
I never thought there'd be anything like this down here. They don't really talk much about below the plate, you know? Zack said something similar when he first came here.
Brushing absently at his pocket, Cloud's fingers found the familiar lump of his wallet. Reminded, he added,
"Be careful of pickpockets."
It didn't take him long to find the stall he needed. Dried herbs hung off the poles that held up a sheet of metal siding that served as the booth's roof, and there were bottles, powders, and more herbs spread across the display table for the wares. The middle-aged couple that ran it weren't unwelcoming, but he could see the wariness in the wife's eyes as he made his request, her eyes never leaving his soldier uniform. Halfway through his bargaining, Connolly ducked out of the stall, returning a few minutes later with a small package tucked under his arm. Cloud gave him a questioning look, but only got a headshake in response. They didn't dawdle once their business was complete. As expected, the more expensive, better quality potions were not even available in the limited market, but other more colloquial remedies had been readily at hand. Great Malayan, a herb that would help clear out Poppy's lungs and soothe her throat. White willow, echinacea, peppermint, and ginger mixtures that could be made into teas to help reduce the fever. Mild enough for a child, and hopefully flavorful enough that Poppy would willingly drink them. He'd also bought a few of the generic health potions. They'd help strengthen Poppy once the worst of her symptoms had been treated. If Aerith was willing, too, she could keep him informed of Poppy's condition, and if it improved or not, so he could provide further assistance if needed. There were other remedies to try as well. He'd leave Jessie a list, or Aerith, as she wouldn't balk at using his money to buy such things. It wasn't like he used it for much else than food, and he had no interest in saving money earned from Shinra. Better to be used this way. When he and Connolly knocked at the door, it was jerked open immediately, this time by a scowling Jessie.
"Took you long enough," she muttered. "Miss Aerith has been casting magic this entire time you've been gone."
"Only twice," Aerith corrected calmly, smiling up in welcome at him. She pulled herself onto the pallet, propping Poppy's body up so that she was no longer lying flat. "I'm afraid it hasn't done much for poor Poppy's cough, though. What did you do before? That seemed to help for a bit longer." He knelt down next to Aerith, taking in Poppy's pale face. Hair stuck to her sweaty face, and she moaned softly and moved in Aerith's arms.
"I can teach you,"
he said, brushing the hair away before he pressed his hand against Poppy's forehead. Still too hot. The position Aerith had her in at least provided some relief. As he began unwrapping the medicines, he heard Connolly speak up hesitantly behind him.
I couldn't help but notice it looked like you were trying to, build a radio?"
Glancing over his shoulder, he saw Connolly hover awkwardly over Jessie, who'd returned to her tinkering as soon as it was apparent Cloud wasn't going to pay her any attention.
Yeah, so what if I am? It's not a crime, Shinra,
she snapped, waving a screwdriver at Connolly's face. Turning back, Cloud caught Aerith's eye, amusement plain on her face. He shook his head, scooping up the cup that had been by the bedside and dipping it into the bucket of water. A controlled lick of power in his fire materia had it steaming, and he carefully began mixing in the first of the herbs.
No, Connolly said hastily. I just thought you could use this. I already have one. This variety deer works best when paired with that type of coil you're using. Sit yourself down here, Shinra, and let me take a look.
Aerith's soft laugh drew his attention, but when he looked at her, she just raised a finger to her lips.
What can I do?
She asked quietly, petting Poppy's hair.
Help me get her to drink this,
he said, equally soft. Together, they managed to rouse Poppy long enough to drink most of the medicine, as well as another potion. She didn't seem aware of their presence, but before she dropped off to sleep again, she did focus briefly on Cloud's face with a faint smile. Sitting back on his heels, he sighed softly, aware of the background noise of Connolly and Jessie now that he wasn't lost to concentration. The timing of Poppy's illness was somewhat ironic, following on the heels of his breakdown over Denzel. The same sick feeling of helplessness sat heavily in his chest. This was nothing like the unworldly epidemic of geostigma, but the futility of his efforts still plagued him and made him doubt his ability to help Poppy now. All they could really do was wait and see if the medicines helped. He busied himself brewing another cup, the herbal infusion pungent to his senses, and he handed it to Aerith this time.
You drink too.
Yes, sir, Soldier Cloud, she teased, wrinkling her nose at the strong smell before taking a sip. He glanced down, reminded he hadn't explained his sudden promotion either. Sorry. Yes, I know you are, Cloud, she cut in gently. Zack told me about it, though, so really there's nothing to apologize for. Blinking in surprise, he echoed. Zack did? Yes, silly. It took time, but he called me eventually and we worked it out. She sighed, laying a hand on his arm. And of course he never even thought to tell you. Were you worrying all this time?
If I said no, would you believe me?
He asked ruefully. No, she agreed with a laugh. Thank you for worrying, Cloud.
Hey, what are you two doing over there anyway?
Jessie's voice broke into their conversation, and he twisted around. She'd risen to her feet and was glaring at him, hands on her hips. Connolly was seated on the ground with a screwdriver in one hand, something with a lot of exposed wires in the other, and he looked at Cloud guiltily, as if he'd been caught out doing something wrong. Easing out from under Poppy, and taking care that the movement didn't aggravate the cough, Aerith rose and brushed lightly at her dress, smiling over at Jessie. I'd like to return home briefly. My mother will worry if I'm out too long, and I think she'd be willing to help with Poppy's recovery. Hey, I never said... Jessie began indignantly, but cut off when Cloud rose to his feet too. I'll walk you, he said, gesturing her to lead the way out the door. Tilting his head at Connolly, he added, Are you staying? Just a minute. Jessie stomped her foot, then cast a guilty look over at her sister at the noise. Connolly grinned nervously, eyes flicking between Jessie and Cloud.
I'll certainly try.
No one asked you.
Well, Cloud did.
Hiding his grin as he ducked out the door, Cloud shut it quietly behind him as Jessie loomed over Connolly angrily. He'd only gone a few steps when it opened again, and Jessie stuck her head out, hollering, And stop smirking, soldier! The door clicked quietly shut, though he suspected Jessie wanted to slam it. You do make the most interesting first impressions, Aerith chided gently, winding her arm in his. Mom has been asking when you'd stop by again, to show off your new rank. We wouldn't want to disappoint her. Sighing, but warmed by Aerith's cheer, He resigned himself to the idea that everyone was going to comment on his rank, one way or another from now on. There was still a lot left unsaid between them, but they would have time to talk later. He wouldn't leave her again.
If she tries to pinch my cheeks, I'm leaving. Year 0002, September 1st.
He had the uncomfortable feeling of déjà vu as he looked at the man who'd approached Cloud, as he was finishing his midday meal. It was rather like looking at Zack through a distorted glass. The Turk's hair was the same deep black, spiky despite his efforts to smooth it back. The shape of his face as well was similar, and the light eyes and fair complexion all called to mind the contours of his friend's face. There was even a scar on the same cheek. Other things, such as the glasses and suit, dispelled the image, but Cloud still frowned at the similarities.
What?
The Turk pushed his glasses up, leaning on the cafeteria table across from him.
I asked if you would like to spar.
If he was aware of the rapt attention the rest of the room was paying him, he didn't show it. Cloud waved off a pair of thirds, who looked like they wanted to interfere, and they sank back into their seats reluctantly. The Turk wasn't doing anything yet to warrant negative attention. Cloud wondered if he knew what happened the last time a Turk bothered him on soldier ground. Normally, the cafeteria was more of a neutral territory, but no Turk had ever directly approached a soldier either. Cloud didn't say anything for several long moments. The Turk didn't seem bothered by the silence, and was merely staring unflinchingly back with a pleasant expression on his face. He'd been one of the Turks he'd seen during the Hippogriff roundup, but for the life of him, Cloud could not remember what code name he'd used. Finally, he came to the reluctant conclusion the Turk wasn't going to leave without an answer.
Why? I would like to ask you some questions, and my observations of you tell me you would be more comfortable in a competitive environment.
The answer came easily and bluntly, and Cloud felt his eyebrows rise in honest surprise. He hadn't expected such a direct answer from a Turk. Ever, really. The closest he could think of were times when Elena said more than she was meant to. There was no good reason at all to accept, and a number of reasons why Cloud should avoid such a confrontation entirely, but...
All right,
he agreed, pushing to his feet. He could admit he was curious what this Turk was after. Standing as well, the Turk smiled pleasantly.
Excellent.
In one fist he held a sheathed weapon, and Cloud recalled now that he'd introduced himself as Katana before. At least their naming scheme was easy to remember.
The training room should be free by now?
From anyone else, that statement wouldn't cause alarm, but this was a Turk who knew very well how fights with Cloud in the training room went. Not to mention that the room's records were accessible by the soldier scientists. He was always careful to make sure the recording equipment was turned off when he was there. The Turks, however, could have set up any number of hidden surprises if Katana had been planning this for a while. He gestured Katana to lead the way, unwilling to have the Turk at his back. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Russell and Luxier head for the doors to the back stairway, a few of the other soldiers tagging along behind them. He didn't draw any attention to the other soldiers' odd behavior as he stepped into the hallway behind Katana, who'd already pressed the button to call the elevator. While they waited, he took the time to study Katana's profile again. Maybe it was because he'd missed his friend, but it made him uncomfortable to see someone so similar to Zack, who also so obviously wasn't.
My hometown is Gongaga,
Katana said suddenly, turning and catching Cloud's eye with his own. Cloud didn't react beyond a blink at being caught staring, and he hummed quietly in acknowledgement. That did explain the resemblance, at least, if it was the truth. He was still suspicious of this overly straightforward Turk. Katana smiled again, and this time the resemblance was lost completely. Zack's smile was wide, open, often followed by laughter, and making his face shine with good humor. Katana's polite grin couldn't have been further from that if he tried.
We're a very straightforward people, but you already knew that, didn't you?
Cloud's sharp frown went ignored as the elevator doors slid open, and Katana proceeded ahead of him without prompting.
What do you want?
He snapped, stepping in after and crossing his arms as he glared.
I've heard a lot about you and wished an opportunity to learn more. One can only rely on rumor and second-hand information to a certain point.
That was both direct and completely unhelpful. He could assume that what he'd heard had come from other Turks. But was he here in an official capacity to observe Cloud? Or was this more of a personal inquiry of the local oddity? Cloud kept stubbornly silent the rest of the trip, though Katana seemed unbothered by either the silence or the staring. His vague smile never wavered, and in turn, he took the opportunity to openly study Cloud. As before, when they reached the soldier floor, Katana exited the elevator first without hesitation. With another frown at the back of the Turk's head, Cloud followed silently behind. When they reached the training room, he was unsurprised to see other soldiers already waiting in the observation area. He did take some satisfaction in seeing Katana's shoulders tense at their inclusion. Add that to your data pile. Luxier pushed himself away from the wall he'd just been leaning against, swaggering forward a few steps to pass Katana and thump Cloud on the shoulder.
Just thought we'd pop by and keep an eye on things. You've got no objections, right, Turk?
The latter was directed over his shoulder at Katana, who gave a polite grin.
Of course not. So long as Cloud has no objections, that is.
Which could mean anything. Either he was confident that what he was looking for was something Cloud would share publicly, or he was leaving it up to Cloud to chase away the other soldiers so his secrets wouldn't be outed. Since Cloud had no intention of letting out any information that would ruffle Shinra's feathers, he didn't care either way. Besides, he appreciated the unasked-for show of solidarity. Part of it was probably residual hard feelings over Renault and Rude's altercation in the soldier compound and a desire for a rematch. Even if the Turk in question was different, and if their presence hindered Katana in his investigation, all the better, unless he was willing to publicly press for secrets. Unlikely as that scenario was, it would give him an idea of how close on his trail the Turks were in general. Stepping away from Luxier's grip, Cloud nodded at him as he moved the controls to punch in a simple stage and double-check that the recording was off.
There's no problem,
he said quietly, both in response to the comment, as well as to reassure that Katana wasn't anything he couldn't handle.
But don't neglect your own duties over this,
he added, sweeping his gaze across the others pointedly. All he needed was another restriction put upon him because he encouraged the delinquency of other soldiers.
I'm off for the day,
Russell said with a grin.
When you're done, I wouldn't mind going around too.
He didn't specify with who, Cloud noted with amusement. Sweeping a hand at the doorway, he gestured Katana to precede him into the training room proper.
No headsets,
he said when Katana reached for them.
Ah, no interference,
Katana agreed.
It's certainly better that way.
Humming neutrally, he didn't respond to that. They didn't need the realism for a simple spar, and he preferred to keep his actual eyes on the Turk. Keying in the start command from his phone caused the harsh electric lighting to be replaced with the bright imitation sunlight shining over a flat wasteland. No obstacles, no enemies, just a basic training platform. Drawing his sword, he turned to face Katana fully as he dropped into a ready stance. Across from him, Katana was looking around the area with interest, but stopped and regarded Cloud silently for a moment. He smiled suddenly, and Cloud felt himself tense when he drew his weapon, bringing it up over his shoulder and settling into the familiar stance favored by Sephiroth. It wasn't unreasonable for another swordsman to use, but he knew it was a deliberate imitation. He just didn't know why. Katana broke the tableau, charging forward and striking with a spinning cut that Cloud blocked automatically. Again, the move was right out of Sephiroth's repertoire, though it was unsuited to the shorter length of Katana's weapon in comparison to Masamune. Cloud shoved away rather than pressing forward for the obvious unguarded side. While he could end the fight now, if he really wanted to, he was both curious and confused as to what Katana was going for with his imitation. That kind of game would only hurt his chances of beating Cloud, if that was his goal at all, so more likely there was a hidden meaning that Cloud was missing. Katana pushed the offensive with blows that were disconcertingly gentle compared to what Cloud was used to. Even taking Sephiroth out of the equation, there was no force behind the swordplay. It was as if Katana was just going through the motions. Cloud began to soften his own blows in compensation, and found it much harder to do than he expected. Sure, he'd pulled his strength when fighting others who were weaker than him, but not to this extent. Besides, most people who were weaker than him were much more skilled, such as Tifa, who would routinely kick his ass in training if he didn't put effort into it. He hadn't realized how used to fighting others of his own strength he'd become, or how much he relied on that strength when performing some of his normal counters to Sephiroth's attacks. Instead of using the forceful blows and weighty cuts to assist in his movements, he found he had to move himself more to compensate. He was so caught up in the novelty of the fight that he almost forgot who he was fighting against. With a twist of his wrist, Katana locked their blades together on the next clash. He met Cloud's eyes coolly, a faint smile on his face.
"You've had a lot of practice, I see."
And just like a bucket of water had been poured over him, Cloud's enjoyment faded into a scowl. He heaved against their swords, and Katana moved quicker than expected to dodge out of the way of the next attack, while skipping back a few steps to remain out of reach. Cloud didn't bother pursuing, too irritated at himself for playing into the Turk's game. He couldn't help but feel he'd lost that round.
"Ah, well,"
Katana said, straightening up. He pushed up his glasses with his free hand, then shifted the grip on his sword again. It didn't look like any sword stance Cloud could recognize this time, but there was still something familiar about it. When he came at Cloud, this time he swung with the flat of the blade, using his weapon as a blunt instrument rather than the sword it was, still with that contradictory softness. Cloud sighed in resignation as he replied in kind. The difference between the two styles, and the fact that Katana was able to perform them both easily, was distracting. It was somewhat fascinating, with the subtle and overt differences, and how Katana never broke style, even when Cloud tried to slip in a trick or two. So much so that it took him longer than it should have to recognize Reno's distinctly lax fighting style. Really, it was only when Katana snubbed his nose with his free hand that Cloud caught on, and he was nearly smacked upside the head when he paused in incredulity at the thorough imitation. Ducking the swing, he used the move to attack with a leg sweep, unsurprised when Katana backflipped over the attack and away. There was a crackle of static when Luxier's voice sounded over the room's comm system.
"Come on, speed it up. We're all waiting for a turn, you know."
Cloud raised an eyebrow at the second's impatience, hopping back a few feet as Katana regained his stance. This time, when he charged in, Katana spoke, his voice showing little of the strain of their exercise.
"Does it bother you that you're being watched?"
It wasn't in reference to Luxier's interruption, not with the way Katana was so deliberately choosing the style of a Turk that Cloud would, on record, be most familiar with. Wondering how detailed Katana's knowledge of Cloud's interactions with Reno was, he used the next opportunity when Katana swung at his head to repeat the move he'd done before. Ducking the blow, he grabbed Katana's leg and pulled hard, using the momentum to send him into a spin. To his credit, Katana kept a hold of his weapon when he recovered from the attack. He was still smiling faintly though, so either he'd anticipated it, or was just a better fighter than Reno was. Pressing an offense, Cloud sped up his attacks against Katana, sparks drifting between them as the edge of his blade scraped on the flat of the other. The increased speed didn't prove impossible for Katana to keep up with, though his face was now a frown of concentration as he blocked Cloud's blows, and he was losing the rhythm of Reno's style. Putting on another burst of speed, Cloud had the satisfaction of Katana breaking entirely as he was forced to utilize his sword properly to deflect Cloud's blows, catching and holding Cloud's sword against his own. Leaning in a fraction, Cloud said quietly, "It doesn't bother me when the attention is invited." They broke apart again, and Katana switched his weapon to his other hand, shaking out the one he'd been using. Cloud slipped into a guarded stance and waited, wondering what the Turk's next move would be. He found with some surprise, still having fun. Sure, he knew he was giving something away to the Turk with this fight, but at the same time, he no longer had any reason to keep his fighting prowess a secret. They already knew he sparred with Sephiroth. There wasn't much more he could do to his reputation after that. It wasn't anything like the test of strength fighting other soldiers was. It was slower, more deliberate, but it still had the thrill of danger, as Cloud knew Katana was studying him closely, looking for answers to questions Cloud didn't want him to know. Katana's obvious skill was also a refreshing change. It reminded Cloud of spars with Tifa, who'd been extremely skilled herself, and could still catch him unawares by her talent alone. Katana regarded him silently for a moment, before he smiled again.
"I take it then my presence today is not unwelcome? By your own words?"
Cloud snorted softly, but didn't refute the claim. He had invited the session, as Katana pointed out. Nodding to himself, Katana looked Cloud up and down, then brought both hands to grip the hilt of his weapon loosely. This time, his stance was wide, as if he were compensating for a much larger weapon, and Cloud had no trouble identifying Zack's familiar pattern. Shaking his head in admiration, Cloud initiated the attack this time, movements he performed 100 times against his friend coming naturally. Though this time it was more deliberate, as he slowed his speed again to match Katana's. He'd never paid much attention to his own form, merely letting his body move into the positions it needed to be, too busy trying to keep his skin intact to worry about it. Part of that, too, was the leftover imprint of when he'd masqueraded as a soldier before, when he'd adopted Zack's fighting style without even understanding the mechanics behind it. It was harder to do it this way. Katana was only using the flat of his blade. That was interesting, because Cloud knew Zack would use the blade. Indeed, had been more and more lately. Something had changed in his friend to make that okay, though he didn't know what exactly had been the trigger. It was something of a relief, as he had worried if that hesitation would cost him if it did come down to a fight against Sephiroth. Either Katana didn't know of the change, or he was deliberately using Zack's outdated style.
"You're quite skilled,"
Katana said with a nod, shifting his grip slightly for his next attack. It wasn't a move Cloud recognized, and he fumbled to block the swing despite the slow speed of the attack. Instead of pressing, Katana stepped back, then initiated the same attack again. This time, Cloud had time to react, and with a frown he blocked the move again, the motions coming a bit easier. Again, Katana stepped back and performed the attack, at an accelerated speed. It was no problem to block it, now that Cloud had the hang of what he was supposed to do. With a pleased grin, Katana backed off further, freeing one hand to push his glasses up.
And a quick learner.
Cloud frowned, bringing his sword to his side as he studied Katana's face. That was a strange comment. Was he testing to see if Zack had really mentored Cloud, as their cover story suggested? Maybe it was lucky that Cloud's normal style was so similar to Zack's then.
With such an unusual case, Katana continued, it's impressive you were able to perform at soldier level without difficulty.
He hesitated, then gave a deliberate little shrug, catching Cloud's gaze and holding it.
Some find that harder to believe than others.
Cloud felt a chill go down his spine as Katana's eyes flicked upward just briefly.
Can't please everyone,
he muttered, Hojo least of all. Katana guffawed, a sharp bark of laughter that cut off almost as soon as it began.
How true!
His smile this time was easier, less stiffly polite and correct, but more genuine.
Even you?
He asked, tilting his head in query. When he stepped out to attack, he seemed much looser and relaxed, and Cloud guessed he was no longer imitating others, but using his own style. The pace of their spar picked up as Katana utilized his weapon to its full extent, and Cloud sped up to match. Breaking apart, Cloud's boots slid along the floor briefly as he regained traction.
I don't like false praise,
he said, leaping up and forward to come down on Katana with a two-handed swing. Instead of blocking, Katana flowed to the side, deflecting Cloud's momentum and using the opening provided to lash out at Cloud's unprotected side. Cloud was able to twist away in time, but thrilled at the near miss. The next swing had their swords locking together briefly near the hilts, and Katana leaned his weight forward as Cloud pressed to dislodge him. He caught Cloud's eyes and gave a low hum.
Your eyes really are quite striking in person.
Cloud felt his face flush, and he immediately shoved hard to send Katana staggering backward. Was that supposed to be a message? Was it false praise, labeling him as someone who couldn't be trusted? Narrowing his eyes, Cloud blurted out, "You," before he was cut off by the intercom crackling to life again.
Okay, I draw the line at overt flirting.
Luxier's voice said dryly.
Break it up and give us a turn.
He had to bring one hand up to cover his burning face at the reminder they were being observed. Katana didn't appear bothered, relaxing his stance to push his glasses up the bridge of his nose again. His voice was guileless as he responded.
Flirting? You misunderstand. I am an admirer of beautiful things, no matter what form they take.
Either way, I'm tired of watching you two dance around each other. Let me in there. Cloud could use a real fight.
Russell's voice cut in the background, sounding put out.
Hey, no, I called dibs, Lux, yeah?
There was a sudden thump and high-pitched whine from the intercom, as if Luxier had jerked and knocked against the mic, and a third, clearly distinguishable voice said,
I believe I am next.
Letting his hand drop to his side, Cloud breathed in deeply, releasing the breath in a long sigh. Why does he always show up at the worst of times? Sephiroth appeared, stepping through the doorway directly into the simulation. His entrance was heralded with a ripple as the program adjusted for his presence, the green lighting of the room briefly visible in the wave as it passed beneath Cloud's feet. Masamune was already bare in his hand, and his narrow gaze settled on Katana for a moment, before moving on to focus on Cloud. For the second time that day, Cloud was witness to the unique pose as Sephiroth brought Masamune up and over his shoulder, crouching in a ready position.
Allow me to show you true skill once more. I don't suppose I can sit this one out,
Katana said delicately.
No,
Sephiroth said simply, never taking his eyes off Cloud. There was a pinch around Katana's eyes and a tenseness in his body. Clearly he hadn't signed up for a round against Shinra's top soldier. The growing buzz in Cloud's head was a jumble of irritation, tinged with a sort of satisfaction. Had Sephiroth interrupted on purpose? Shaking his head, Cloud merely said, "Try to keep your skin intact." Then he leapt as Sephiroth charged. Year 0002, September 6th.
Stepping from the elevator and onto the soldier floor, Sephiroth reflected that Vieri was getting entirely too big to be bringing into the building. That would hardly stop him. Besides, he generally enjoyed a car to himself, no matter what, so Vieri was able to settle in with him. There was a scrabble of claws and the pat of the chocobo's splayed toes against the tile as he followed after him. A few thirds that were loitering in the halls started in surprise as Sephiroth walked past them, heading for the door to the briefing room. He had a niggling feeling that his quarry would be found within. Turning to Vieri, he nudged his head aside as the bird attempted to nibble at his bangs. "Down!" he ordered, and immediately Vieri folded his legs beneath himself and sunk to rest on the floor. "Stay!" Once he was certain of the chocobo's compliance, Sephiroth reached out and ran a hand over Vieri's crest. Turning, and leaving Vieri to preen himself in response to the praise, he keyed open the door and stepped into the room's foyer. Glancing towards the mission board, he spied Cloud next to two other thirds. He strode towards them, boot heels clicking on the smooth tile. Stopping just behind them, he reached past Cloud's shoulder to scroll through the missions they'd been examining. He paid no attention to the other two thirds, startling as he gave a low hum. I had wondered. It made sense now. The reports he'd been hearing about Cloud. These are second-class assignments. There was a slight tug on his hair as Cloud brushed away a strand that had fallen across his shoulder.
3/3 are capable of completing these assignments,
he said quietly, and one blue eye peeked up at him from under the soldier helmet as Cloud tilted his head up to see Sephiroth's face. Sephiroth drew away, stepping back a pace. That doesn't explain the ones you completed solo. It was, perhaps, petty of him, but then Sephiroth had never much cared to curb his petty desires. Besides, the boy was an irritant, a thorn in his side. He hadn't been able to complete any of his research in recent weeks. It seemed any time he would be in the library, Cloud Strife would appear, to lurk and linger until he agreed to a spar, or to fetch Vieri for him, or any other asinine distraction. It was strange, and Sephiroth still had no idea why Cloud was seeking him out. If Cloud had been like Genesis, he might be able to understand it. Genesis, after all, had wanted to dethrone him, to show himself better than Sephiroth. Cloud seemed to have no such motive, and even the idea he'd held some grudge against him seemed to have faded to the wayside. It only left Sephiroth more perplexed than ever. An enemy he didn't quite know how to combat, for he was uncertain of what the enemy was. "Sorry, sir," Cloud said neutrally. "I found a glitch to exploit in the system." "Did you?" he asked musingly, then half-turned. Glancing back, Sephiroth lifted a hand and crooked his fingers. "I would like to have a word with you, third." A spike of pain flared in his temple, as if someone had given him enough of a tap to bruise. It faded in seconds, but the echo remained, like the aftertaste of blood. Irritated for a moment, Sephiroth only became more so under the fact that he had no reason to be irritated right then. The unexplained mood swings, the continued headaches, the jangle in his nerves. It was slowly driving him mad. He was still certain that Cloud Strife had something to do with them all. He'd never experienced anything of the like until Cloud had come to his attention. There was a low murmur from one of the other thirds, Then Cloud's quiet retort floated over. "Our mission request has already been accepted by the system." The last dregs of irritation faded, only to be replaced by a bone-deep exasperation he'd felt more often lately than he ever had before. Leave it to this boy to be so contrary at all times. He should have expected it, and yet he'd had the vague hope that he might prove a little more tractable for once. For a moment, he let his gaze track up higher, and considered how easy it would be to grab Cloud by his scruff and get him moving himself. Or maybe he could run him through and carry him off that way. It was an appealing proposition. However, Sephiroth's superiors would likely frown on such action, and he had no want to drive himself to an entirely different headache by listening to them. Turning his attention back down to Cloud, he said, "It can wait." This time Cloud nodded, falling into step behind Sephiroth without further protest. Leading the way back out into the halls of the soldier floor, Sephiroth called Veery to his claws and made his way back towards the door to the stairwell. There were less security measures there, allowing for easier conversation about sensitive topics. Inside the shadowy stairwell, he watched Veery cheerfully skip up a few of the steps. Sephiroth glanced back at Cloud as he joined them, and then started to pace upward. "I had thought," he said, voice dry as if he were musing on something inane like the weather, "you didn't want to climb in the ranks." "I'm already in soldier. They can't—" Stopping on the next landing, Sephiroth allowed himself to snort and turned to look down at Cloud. "Do you believe that?" There was a look of deep aggravation on Cloud's face, and he frowned up at Sephiroth. "Already?" he asked cryptically, dropping his eyes to stare at the steps in front of him. Wonderful. It seemed he had a brain in there somewhere. Sephiroth leaned back against the wall of the stairwell and turned his head to watch Veery play on the next set of steps upward. "Congratulations," he said, allowing his tone to take on a litting purr out of spite. "Your exemplary performance has come to your superior's attention, and they want to give you your dues." "Damn it!" The curse was sharp in the empty stairwell, echoing off the walls, and Cloud seethed, clenching and unclenching his fists at his side. Watching him unblinkingly, Sephiroth studied his reaction. A part of him triumphed in Cloud's clear upset. It was good to put him off balance for once. "It seemed you've lost track of your brilliant strategy. At least I can put that as a black mark on your record." Blue eyes flashed up to meet his, and for a moment Sephiroth wondered if Cloud was going to attack him right then. There it was, the threat of challenge, of someone standing up to Sephiroth, as Cloud had so long ago. It was gone again in a moment, though the promise of it lingered sweetly in the air. If he could just crack Cloud open and see more of that, then he might just get a taste of the truth he sought. Who are you, really? Cloud made no move, his expression slipping away to a more neutral mask as he brought his emotions under control. His voice, when he spoke, held nothing of the burning anger or challenge of a moment ago. "Thank you, sir, for the warning." The tension and expectancy drained out of him and left behind the faint pang of disappointment at this sudden change. Back to normal, to the routine. What he wanted was to see that anger at full force, to learn what drove the desperation he remembered so clearly from their first fight. If he could only figure out how to fan the flames of that reaction, to learn what made Cloud tick, then he could figure him out. It was frustrating and fascinating by turns. Sephiroth wasn't certain which it was more of right then. "Keep it in mind."
Year 0002, September 7th. Soldiers didn't exactly intimidate him anymore, but Connolly was nervous all the same. He loitered for a while, leaning against the side of a building down from the gate into the soldier complex. It was funny. It had been a shared admiration and desire to get into soldier that had allowed him to befriend Cloud in the first place. Now Cloud had made it into soldier, and not just that. Cloud was doing well in soldier. There were times when Connolly felt jealous, maybe even a little bitter, but the rest of the time he was happy for him. It would have been worse if Cloud had completely disregarded him, as he'd seemed to be doing after Medeal. But things were better lately. Better, and he privately thought, worse. He felt bad about his stray, jealous thoughts when he considered the damage Cloud seemed to have received from his dip in the Mako. Connolly still wasn't certain to what extent Cloud's memories had been damaged, and he hadn't really had the courage to try and find out. A part of him didn't want to know. Another part of him just really missed having Cloud around. After their failed attempt to get into soldier, he'd hoped they could keep working towards it, maybe improve, and next time they'd succeed. Cloud hadn't seemed as hopeful, had been withdrawn for the failure, as if all of his dreams had suddenly been crushed. But Connolly had been sure they could manage it. Hard work always pays off. At least that's what he believed. Then Cloud had fallen in the Mako and been fine. It wasn't a surprise that Soldier had taken such an interest in him, and Connolly had lost his partner. For months, Connolly had been in limbo. It wasn't easy to shuffle people around. He'd been there before, though, so it wasn't too bad. After his partner before Cloud died, Corporal Stevens had given him work taking care of the squad's tech gear, and really, Connolly had always been happy to do that job. Technology didn't make him think of Mennings dying under his hands. But then they'd gotten a replacement sooner than expected, and there was Cloud. Connolly had never gotten on that well with the rest of the squad. He'd been the youngest, and he didn't much care for conflict one way or another. They weren't nasty people, but they liked to tease him. He'd gotten used to it, but once Cloud was around, just the thought of it brought a wry grin to Connolly's face. One thing hadn't changed at least. Cloud always attracted and caused trouble, no matter what. In the time since he'd partnered with Cloud, Connolly had been dragged into more fights through Cloud's smart mouth than he'd ever been in his life. There had even been times when Cloud had started fights on his behalf, particularly when Mavis would say something out of line in his teasing. Connolly hadn't really cared, but Cloud was loyal once you won him over. It was the winning over that was the hard part. He could hardly believe how much things had changed. The worst part was, it didn't seem like it would right itself anytime soon. If anything, he had a feeling this was only the tip of the proverbial iceberg, and the warm sunshine wasn't melting it fast enough. He was getting tired of hiding his head in the sand, though. Between the things he'd heard back out near the Chocobo Ranch, and what he'd overheard on the 29th, along with Cloud's strange behavior and the stress of dealing with Mavis as his new partner, he was stressed with all the things he knew and all the things he didn't know. With Harrison discharged from the military after he'd lost his arm up north, Mavis had been paired off with Connolly as the only member of their squad without a partner. Their squad was down by 2, and it seemed their superiors had more important things to focus on than evening out the ranks right then. At least Mavis wasn't as mouthy as he used to be. He'd become sullen and withdrawn, really, and Connolly understood it well. He knew the type of guilt that Mavis was feeling. He still felt it sometimes over Mennings himself. And, if he admitted it to himself, over Cloud. He couldn't help but wonder if he should have done more to make sure Cloud hadn't fallen into the Mako. But at least Cloud was alive and kicking. Kicking even harder than he was before at that. In fact, it almost seemed like Cloud had gained another entire personality overnight. The change in him was so abrupt. Could a bout of Mako poisoning really have done that? There were rumors, but Cloud hadn't even seemed to have a bad case of it, which was the weirdest part. Connolly wasn't an idiot, and he'd been right there when Cloud fell in. He knew what he'd been dunked in, and he'd expected him to be dead. But he wasn't, and something was going on. Connolly felt it in his bones, even if he wasn't exactly certain what it was. If there was one thing he was good at, besides repairing tech and taking care of it, it was knowing when to keep his mouth shut and when to finally open it. That was what brought him here, to the gate of the soldier compound, and the hopes of finally getting some of his questions answered. He could go to Cloud himself with his suspicions, but he was worried that he'd alienate him, and right now he didn't want to stress their friendship just when it was getting back to something resembling normal. If Zack had been around, he could have gone and asked for a word with him. Cloud seemed to hold Zack in high regard, and Zack was definitely a part of what was going on. There was only one other person Connolly could think of to go to. The second-class soldier who told him where to find Cloud, who Cloud said was a friend, a trusted friend. That had to mean something more coming from Cloud. More than anything, though, he was worried. Partners looked out for each other, even when they weren't technically partners anymore. Connolly stepped away from the wall and squared his shoulders before putting his helmet on. At least this way he could pretend he was here on official business. Hitching his rifle further up on his shoulder, Connolly strode down the street and hoped he looked like he had a legitimate purpose for being there. Coming up to the guard booth, he stopped and saluted the third on guard. "Excuse me," he said, holding the position. "I was wondering if, Soldier Kunzel was in the compound?" The third regarded him behind the glass and from behind his helmet. Soldier helmets really were so much nicer to look at than a regular infantryman's. It made him feel a little self-conscious, standing there as a regular trooper. But Connolly held his ground and waited out the inspection. Instead, he tried to remember if he'd ever seen Cloud with his soldier helmet on, or Zack for that matter. Had any of the legendary firsts ever worn them? The third's gruff reply pulled him out of his thoughts.
"How should I know?"
Biting back a disappointed sigh, Connolly asked,
"I don't suppose you could let me in to see?" "What for?"
"Why can't this be easy for once?"
"I need to deliver a message to him." "Under whose orders?"
He'd been afraid of this. Biting the inside of his cheek, Connolly thought fast. He could say Cloud had sent him, possibly, but that was treading dangerous territory. Instead, he blurted out, "That's confidential, sorry." The third grunted and settled back in his seat, his gaze dropping to the book he was paging through.
"Then go tell 'em they better give you an authorization to get into the soldier compound, or you aren't getting in."
Deflating, Connolly gave a jerky nod.
"Right, okay."
He turned sharply on his heel and strode back down the street. It looked like that avenue was bunk. Time for him to try Plan B, checking the Shinra building and see if he could run across Kunzel there, or someone who could get a message to him, like Gibbs or Edge. He didn't have the clearance to get to the soldier floor either. Breaking into a jog, Connolly cut through Sector 8 and dodged around the crowds on Loveless Avenue and in the Fountain Plaza. It wasn't that late in the day, but already there were a few people sitting on the rim of the fountain, or loitering outside the sprinkling of shops around the square. Connolly ignored them as he darted up the street towards the Shinra building. As he reached the front doors, he pulled out his ID and ran it through the machine to get his rifle past the metal detectors. Inside the lobby, he headed for the receptionist's while he caught his breath. At least one thing had gone right for him. Layla was working the desk. "Hey, Layla," he said, sucking in a deep breath and reaching up to yank his helmet off. He tucked it under his arm and smiled in response to the welcoming one she gave him. "Do you know if any of the guys are in yet?" Layla tapped 2 fingers against her lips and looked up thoughtfully. "I know Sparrow and Jack are off duty today, so they're visiting Calm." She heaved a sigh. "Jack better not blow all his money on the races again. We're supposed to have a nice dinner sometime this week. This is what I get for agreeing to date an infantryman. You know, I should have kept holding out for a soldier." Connolly cracked a smile, knowing she wasn't serious. He'd heard it from her before, but she kept on with Jack despite it all. He didn't know much about their relationship, aside from her occasional griping, but they seemed to have fun together. Connolly supposed that was what mattered in the end. Cloud came in earlier than usual this morning, and he didn't look too happy." Connolly cracked a grin. "When does he?" "I hear he has a cute smile," she said with a shrug. "Don't let Jack hear you say that. He might get jealous." Layla laughed, her shoulders shaking, and leaned against the desk. "Of me or him?" Connolly chuckled and shook his head. Jokes about Jack's enthusiasm, where Cloud was concerned, were another part of the norm. "So, what about Gibbs and Edge? Did they already come in?" Tapping her fingers on the desktop, Layla turned her eyes upward in thought. "Yes, they did. About an hour ago. I don't remember them leaving again." That was a relief. There was hope yet that he'd be able to get hold of Kunzel. The only problem was, he had no idea how long he'd need to wait. With a groan, Connolly ran his hand through his hair. "Thanks, Layla. I'll talk to you later. I need to stake out the elevator." "That important, huh?" "Yeah." It was definitely important. Turning away, Connolly made his way back to the stairs on the right, and trotted up them past the display cases and to the glass tables arrayed on the upper section of the lobby. Picking out one of the tables closest to the elevator, Connolly placed his helmet on the glass and settled into a chair, positioning himself so he could see easily. Taking out his phone, he started going through his messages while he waited. He had a feeling he was going to be here for a while. He was right. His phone said he'd been there for over an hour now. In between watching the elevator, he watched the odd civilians touring the open areas of the building curiously. With a yawn, Connolly crossed his arms on the table and rested his head on them. A few minutes later, between one blink and the next, he dozed off. Someone jostled him, and Connolly woke with a start. He sat bolt upright, blinking, and looked up. Cloud stared down at him, expression as neutral as ever. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah," Connolly muttered. Yawning, he stretched and rubbed at his eyes before looking back up. He choked on the words as he noticed who was standing a few feet away, behind Cloud. Looming, all dark and pale, with a full-grown chocobo peering over him, was Sephiroth. Too shocked to move, Connolly couldn't even make himself salute. Cloud half turned to look over his shoulder, then returned his stare to Connolly. His brows rose, and he half shrugged one shoulder. Connolly's eyes dropped when he caught a glimpse of purple fabric bundled under Cloud's arm. If that wasn't a second-class soldier uniform, he'd eat his harness and wash it down with his rifle. "I'm waiting for someone." Cloud nodded and hefted the bundle, his face twisting into a scowl. It softened into a frown, and he asked, "Anything I can do?" Shaking his head, Connolly said, "No, Wait, maybe, yeah. Do you have, Gibbs's number? I never got his." Or Edge's. He'd never been able to bring himself to ask, honestly. He had Jack's, because Jack was overly friendly, and Zach's for some reason. Not that he ever used the latter.
I need to ask him a question.
Without answering, Cloud pulled his phone out and flipped it open. Connolly looked on as he thumbed through the menus, and once Cloud started rattling off the numbers, he grabbed his own phone up and punched them in.
Cloud?
Connolly nearly jumped a foot at the sound of Sephiroth's voice, and jerked his head up to stare wide-eyed past Cloud again. Sephiroth had dropped his gaze from observing the ceiling to stare at Cloud. Cloud glanced over his shoulder and gave a quiet sigh of acknowledgement. Turning back to Connolly, he said,
"See you."
"Yeah," Connolly said, lifting his hand in a vague wave. He couldn't stop staring. Sephiroth flicked a glance his way, but Connolly had the impression that he hadn't even seen him, as if all that filled his chair was, well, nothing. Empty air. He could only watch as Sephiroth strode away, commanding and powerful, with Cloud trailing after to rest a hand on the chocobo's neck. Once he felt like he could breathe again, Connolly ran his hand down his face. It was strange how, when Sephiroth made his presence apparent, Cloud seemed to fade into the background. But when he'd been talking to Cloud, he'd forgotten Sephiroth was even there. It had been the same when they were traveling back to Midgar from Junon, and even during their short mission to the icicle area. Attempting to shake off his addled thoughts, Connolly finished entering Gibbs's information, then hit the button to dial the number. Gibbs answered on the third ring.
"Gibbs Richards, 3rd class."
Hey, Gibbs.
Connolly leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. The hand not holding the phone to his ear tugged on a few strands of hair absently. After a pause, Gibbs asked,
"Connolly?"
Yeah,
he said.
I got your number from Cloud.
"Ah,
Well, at least it didn't sound like Gibbs was upset about it.
what did you need?"
Smiling wryly, Connolly let his hand fall to the table.
You know a guy named Kunzel? A second?
Everyone knows him. Noisiest soldier around. Why?
Is he around?
He couldn't help but feel awkward asking after him. Then again, he hadn't really made an attempt to hide the fact that he still wanted to join Soldier. Maybe after the year he'd had so far, he'd have managed to overcome whatever it was that had failed him before. His mom always liked to say hope springs eternal, which is why she'd never stopped looking for her husband to come back from sea. Connolly had ended up more of a realist than his mom, which was why he'd left to get a job with Shinra to help with money.
Hold on, let me check.
There was a faint sound. Then he heard Gibbs's voice from further away yell,
"Hey, Kunzel!"
Connolly jerked upright, a flush heating his ears. The whole situation just felt weird.
"Come here, would you?"
A little further in the background, he heard Edge ask,
"What's going on?" "He's here."
I heard.
Connolly said, dry humor leaking into his voice.
Can you ask him to come down to the first floor? I need to talk to him.
Gibbs chuckled.
"Sure,"
he said.
"And Connolly,
Yeah?
don't be afraid to call me if you need anything."
The call ended abruptly before Connolly could respond. As he mulled over that in his head, he could feel a smile tugging at his lips. He really did have the weirdest friends. Closing his phone, Connolly pocketed it and sat back in his chair. It wasn't long before the elevator dinged, and he looked over to watch a second step out from the doors and head his way. Looked like Kunzel was here. Sitting up straighter, Connolly lifted his hand to wave, and Kunzel responded in kind before coming to a stop on the other side of the table. Kunzel wrapped his hands over the back of the chair, leaning against it, and nodded at him.
Good to see you again, Connolly.
You too, Connolly said. Fidgeting with the edge of one glove, he cleared his throat.
Thanks again for the other day. No problem,
Kunzel said with a smile.
I was happy to help.
Awkwardly, Connolly scrubbed at his neck under his scarf. His eyes darted from the table up to Kunzel's helmet. to his shoulder guard, then away.
I was hoping I could ask you about something, if you aren't busy.
Sure, he said, pushing himself up straight again.
Come on, let's take a walk outside the building. I could use a little of Midgar's fresh air.
Connolly scooped his helmet up and shoved it on, then stood up. Falling into step, they headed down the stairs and towards the exit. He tucked his thumb under the strap of his rifle, a move so practiced it came to him unconsciously, as he tried to go over the questions he had. Now that he needed to voice them, his mind felt dreadfully blank. Kunzel led the way back out into Sector 8 and cut through Fountain Square. Then he turned and headed away from Loveless Avenue and down along the more empty streets that led towards residential areas. They didn't go too far, but it was enough that the sound of the fountain was lost in the distance. There, Kunzel drifted to a halt beside a railing and leaned his forearms against it, his hands dangling over the drop. Looking down, Connolly studied the lower level, watching as an older man made his way along, heading in the direction of the Shinra building. There was no one around, and no way for anyone to come near enough to hear them talking without them noticing. So Kunzel had figured out what Connolly wanted was not strictly above board then. Looking back up, he peered at Kunzel through his visor and blurted, "Is Cloud in some kind of trouble?" Kunzel didn't so much as twitch, and Connolly couldn't help but feel envious of his composure. If only he had that much control of himself.
"Depends," Kunzel said, "on what sort of trouble you're asking about."
Connolly pressed his palms against the railing and frowned. What kind of trouble was he asking about? That was just it, wasn't it? I want to know what kind of trouble it is.
I overheard some things, he admitted. Let me ask you a question of my own first.
Kunzel's head turned, and Connolly looked back. What he could see of the second's face was serious.
Why do you think I'm a good person to talk to about this?
It was a fair question. For all he knew, he could be getting Cloud into even more trouble by talking to Kunzel. What if Kunzel reported them both for whatever this was? What if it got them hurt, or worse, paid a visit from the Turks? He'd heard that Cloud had already had a lot of dealings with them, that Zack was on good terms with a couple. But how far did that stretch? In the end, though, the answer was simple. None of that mattered when it came right down to it. He never would have come to Kunzel at all if he hadn't had a hunch that it was the right idea. And he was good at keeping secrets. Cloud, Connolly said slowly, said he trusts you. That all? Connolly felt his ears grow hot and his cheeks burn, and looked down at his hands. The visor tinted the world in red anyway, but he still half wondered if it was his own embarrassment. That's enough coming from Cloud. He, doesn't... Cutting himself off, Connolly ducked his head and hunched his shoulders. He had to bite his tongue on the urge to say that Cloud just didn't call people friend very easily or often. While Cloud wasn't the isolated person he'd met originally, he was still distant. Distant, but in a different way. It wasn't the sort of cool aloofness from when they first met, nor the tired wariness he'd known after their failed attempt to join Soldier. And Cloud did have friends now. There was Zack, Gibbs and Edge, Jack and Sparrow, the myriad other soldiers, and even, maybe, Sephiroth. Connolly guiltily swallowed the faint feeling of jealousy that welled up again. Doesn't... Kunzel prompted, and Connolly shrugged, not bothering to finish the thought. With a faint and thoughtful hum, Kunzel popped his chin on his hands.
I can't say much, it's not my place.
Connolly frowned. That was, at least, as good as an admission that there was something going on, and he knew it. Even if he didn't state it explicitly, even if he couldn't tell him exactly what it was.
So, what can you say?
Shoving off the railing, Consul waved for Connolly to fall in with him.
Let's continue our walk.
They drifted further down the street, ambling along at a slow pace in companionable silence, until Consul continued, voice low.
There's trouble, yeah. The Turks are watching them, and I'm letting you know that much because you need to be careful too. They're interested in you because you're close to Cloud.
I know that much. Not that I know anything, well... He trailed off, because that wasn't exactly true, was it? If the Turks were already involved, it was definitely serious. And he wasn't surprised. The slum girl knew there had been a big secret too. Everyone had pieces. He looked at Consul again as he deliberated. Cloud had said he trusted him, so he decided to gamble on that. Maybe it would make more sense to someone with different pieces than Connolly had.
Right after the accident in Medeal, I overheard Zack and Cloud talking. When we stopped at the Chocobo Ranch.
Consul came to an abrupt halt, looking startled. Connolly reached up and fidgeted with his helmet.
They were talking about Soldier, and Genesis and Angeal, the General too.
Zack said that he didn't think they were monsters or something, and asked Cloud to talk to him first if he ever had any issues, and he frowned. And Zack said something about an operation to save the world. Most of it hadn't made any sense, really. It sounded like they were, he didn't know, conspiring. Against who, though? Shinra seemed the most logical answer, but it scared Connolly to think it. Still, all the things he'd seen since Cloud's accident, and the stories Jessie had told him. He'd visited the slums since then, but at first all she talked to him about were the evils of Shinra, and how she was going to stop it one day, almost daring him to come at her, since he technically was Shinra. He hadn't known what to think then, still didn't. Consul was staring at him intently, guarded.
Did you tell anyone?
Mutely, Connolly shook his head. He'd never uttered a word of this to anyone. He'd dismissed it time and again, hadn't really wanted to think about it, but it had always been there, a fact that he knew, that lurked at the back of his mind. He wasn't like Consul was, or Sparrow. He didn't examine things like they did for every scrap of information. He didn't go looking for conspiracy or gossip or anything. All he'd ever wanted was to make Soldier and take care of his mom and travel a little. Consul whistled.
I can't believe you kept this to yourself for so long.
Connolly turned his head away and looked at the buildings across the street.
I didn't want to get Cloud in trouble, and I didn't want to believe it was anything important.
He hadn't wanted to betray his friend either. Cloud had always had his back, and it seemed like the least he could do for him. Now, though, it felt like something big was coming. Cloud being promoted to Soldier, and how he hadn't wanted it. The very thing that had driven Cloud to Shinra in the first place. What happened to him? Connolly didn't have an answer, but he knew he would support him all the same. It was why he was here with Consul to begin with. Turning on his heel, Consul started walking again, and Connolly followed.
You're a good friend for him,
he said lightly.
I don't know much more than you, but I do know something of their goal. I think you should ask Cloud yourself.
That wasn't the answer Connolly was hoping to hear. Miserable as the notion made him feel, he did think Consul was right. Now that he knew it wasn't just him, that he wasn't making something out of nothing, he needed to bite the bullet and talk to Cloud.
How did you find out?
He asked in a quiet mumble. A part of him wanted the question to be lost. No such luck. Consul rolled his shoulders, looking for all the world like he was just taking a lazy stroll to stretch his legs. Connolly felt his envy rise up again, knowing he was tense and couldn't seem to unknot his muscles, no matter how hard he tried. Kunzel slowed his step until Connolly drew even with him again and leaned in closer to speak.
A bit like you did, honestly. I overheard a group of Turks discussing Cloud and Zack. After thinking it over, I decided I needed to tell them what I knew.
Maybe that was why he'd never made it into soldier. Kunzel was able to listen in on Turks, and then come to a steady decision and follow through. Whereas he'd wafted for months and tried to ignore what he'd heard because he didn't want to make the hard choice. Connolly had never been very strong or the bravest person, but he'd never been afraid of hard work and long hours. That's what had gotten him this far. He'd done odd jobs around Costa del Sol at 13 until he could pay for a ticket to Junon, and then he'd enrolled in the military. It hadn't been easy, but he'd done it. Thinking about Kunzel and about Zack, about Cloud and the distance they'd come from.
I will,
he said.
Ask, I mean.
Kunzel's chin dipped in a brief nod, and Connolly realized he was slowly leading them to loop back around towards the Shinra building.
Good. Those two could use all the help and support they can get. Yeah.
They walked on further, silence falling between them again, and Connolly mulled things over while he stared down at his boots. At least following the pattern of his steps was fascinating enough to be distracting for a while.
I was wondering,
Kunzel said, breaking the silence, and Connolly looked up at him curiously.
What was Cloud like before his accident?
Shrugging self-consciously, Connolly adjusted his rifle again to ease the way the strap dug into his shoulder.
He was about the same, but different too.
Kunzel gave a wry grin.
Now that clears up everything.
Connolly gave a weak chuckle.
It's hard to explain.
It was the little things that were so vastly different that he felt like he was talking to a complete stranger. But then there were others that made it seem like it was the same old Cloud.
He was more talkative, I guess. Still quiet, but he tended to run his mouth sometimes. That got him in trouble with, well, everyone.
Kunzel hummed thoughtfully, but didn't comment. That didn't stop Connolly from responding as if he had.
Right? It doesn't sound much different, but Cloud, I don't know,
knows things, does things that don't make any sense, and he broke off abruptly. But he'd come this far, so...
And he has memory issues.
Something in the Mako messed him up. He hesitated again.
Can Mako really do that to a person? Maybe,
Kunzel said.
It depends on how much, how bad, and how equipped they are to handle it.
But, Connolly pressed, can it add memories? At that, Kunzel snorted a laugh. Connolly had no idea what was so funny.
Traditionally, no,
Kunzel replied.
But it can cause hallucinations. Mostly it's tied to a person's life, or even their subconscious, so it's not likely to make up something completely out of the blue.
Which was as good as saying that Cloud had always been like this, somewhere deep down. That was reassuring and scary. Connolly felt like he was on the precipice of something important, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to jump. Their route had brought them near the Sector 1 train station. He could hear the whistle of the train sounding, announcing it was going to leave in a few minutes. His steps slowed to a stop, and Kunzel halted a few feet away.
Thanks,
Connolly said earnestly,
for talking with me. I appreciate it.
While he didn't have any more answers, he was at least confident that Cloud really was mixed up in something Connolly might be able to help with, if he kept his ears open and his head down. Pulling out his phone, Kunzel held it up.
Give me a number, and I'll keep you updated on the goings-on of Shinra.
Kunzel put the number in, as Connolly dutifully recited it.
All right, sorry to leave you at loose ends, but I should get back to work. It was nice talking with you.
Connolly lifted his hand to return Kunzel's brief wave, and stood, watching the second head off towards the nearby stairs that would lead him back towards Shinra Tower. It was strange to think that just earlier he'd been fretting about how to get in contact with him, and now Kunzel had his number, as did Gibbs. The entire thing felt overwhelming, and Connolly let his shoulders hunch. He needed a distraction, something to take his mind off things for a while. Then he could figure out how he was going to talk to Cloud about this. One last thing bugged him, however. He hadn't been able to voice it, and he felt a little silly texting when Kunzel had just walked away. But still, something big is coming. He didn't make it a question. If he had, he didn't think Kunzel would give him a straight answer. When his phone beeped a moment later, the little ball of dread in his stomach grew. "Are you prepared?" The train gave another long whistle, and Connolly glanced towards the platform. Maybe he'd head down to the slums and see if Jessie needed any help today. Her only form of income came from the technological refuse that she scavenged, put back together, or repairs she did for people around the Sector 7 slums. He didn't mind lending a hand. It was a job he enjoyed, and it felt like the only way he could help her and her sister. Poppy, at least, was doing better. She was able to sit up and eat more, and sometimes Cloud's friend Aerith would drop by while he was there. She was nice, and always asked him how his day had gone. Mind made up, Connolly turned and headed towards the station, already pulling out his ID and pass as he jogged forward. He didn't want to have to wait for the next train to arrive. He didn't know what it all meant. He didn't know what the future was going to bring, or if he was making a stupid decision. But stupid or not, his resolve was growing. Cloud needed help, was caught up in something big, and Connolly was going to be there to support him however he could. For now, though, he'd lose himself in the scraps of technology Jessie had dug up. Hopefully, she'd found something particularly difficult, because he really just wanted to deal with something that made sense. He understood radios and technology, knew their pieces, and liked to fit them together like a puzzle. They were easy, unlike people. If Aerith dropped by, they could go out and find more parts, while she kept an eye on Poppy. Good thing he brought his rifle along. Some of the monsters down there were downright nasty. Year 0002, September 9th. Wind from the idling helicopter whipped Sephiroth's hair around him and ruffled the heavy leather of his coat. It was early, before sunrise, though the air station already bustled with activity. He held Masamune in one hand, the long blade naked and gleaming in Midgar's ambient light. With his other hand, he pressed his phone to his ear and waited. As soon as he heard the call go through, he said, "Report to the air station in 5 minutes." He cut off the startled reply by snapping his phone closed and pocketing it. Now, to wait. "Sir!" Sephiroth glanced over at the flight technician. "We're ready to take off." Inclining his head, Sephiroth turned back towards the edge of the helipad. It wasn't long before Cloud appeared, looking ruffled and put upon, and at a quick jog. Though given the time he'd made, he'd likely run a good part of it. Still, "You're late." Only by a few minutes. It would have been impressive if he was looking to be impressed. Sephiroth swept his gaze over Cloud as he came to a halt in front of him, taking in the wild hair and the frown on his face. "Your uniform is incomplete. Thirds and seconds are supposed to stick to the uniform code," he drawled, quoting policy he knew by heart, but hardly cared to enforce. Until now, when it worked in his favor. Cloud's eyes narrowed, and he bit out, "Do you want me to go get my helmet?" "Insubordination already?" Sephiroth mused. If he'd been Genesis, he may have tutted for good measure. As it was, he allowed himself a feeling of amused satisfaction, and turned on his heel. "It would waste more time than you already have."
Sir? The word was ground out from behind gritted teeth. Proper decorum, second, Sephiroth drawled. When no reaction was forthcoming, Sephiroth gave a faint, Continued disobedience. Turning on his heel, he made his way to the waiting helicopter, half, admittedly, to hide the satisfied smirk he couldn't fight back. At least in this, he could use Cloud's irritating reticence. He paused just outside of range of the rotors, and gave the helicopter a long look. While as a means of transportation, they were better than the cramped Shinra transport trucks, he still hardly cared for the effort. Ducking down, he strode to the open doors and climbed into the cabin. He kneeled down, carefully angling Masamune within the confines, and gripped one of the metal bars inside the open cabin doors. Shaking his hair back, Sephiroth glanced back as Cloud entered as well, stepping over Masamune to take his spot on the opposite wall. Disrespecting a superior officer's personal items? Sephiroth said, lazily adjusting his grip on Masamune. It was hardly accurate, but every little bit he was given, he was going to take. He was certain the pilot and co-pilot were listening. He reached over and plucked one of the headsets that hung off a hook in easy reach, settling it on and tucking back a strand of hair that was caught under one ear pad. The whine of the rotors picked up, and the helicopter jolted as it lifted off the tarmac. He swayed easily with it, keeping his balance with no trouble. Sephiroth could almost feel Cloud's stare. The flight to the mission's location wasn't a long one, though it still left plenty of time to contemplate his next move. Sephiroth kept his focus on Masamune's blade, watching the shift of light on the pristine steel. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see long strands of his own hair, and through them, Cloud. After so many spars, he recognized the tension in Cloud's posture for what it was, a sort of amusing reticence. Good. With luck, that could be put to use in other ways than irritating him.
I assume,
Sephiroth said, voice sounding clearly over the faint crackle of static,
that you are up to date on your responsibilities as a second. Sir.
The response held no inflection, and was only just audible through the headset over the sound of the helicopter's rotors. Sephiroth turned his head to look at him fully now, his lips tilting upward in a faint smile. Turned this way, he knew the pilot and co-pilot wouldn't be able to see.
Answer the questions clearly and concisely, soldier.
Cloud's eyes widened fractionally, before narrowing as he rocked back with the motion of the helicopter.
I was briefed on my expected duties.
There was a pause that went on a heartbeat too long to be polite, before he added,
Sir. Very well. 3 minutes to drop zone,
the pilot announced, voice crackling in his ear.
Understood,
Sephiroth responded.
Proceed.
Reaching up, he pulled the headset off negligently and put it back on its hook. Shifting his position, Sephiroth bunched the muscles in his legs and waited, calculating the time in his head. The helicopter came in a little lower, the proper height for a soldier drop, though Sephiroth well knew he could handle greater heights. He almost wanted to demand they go higher, just to push Cloud, just to see if he could manage the same as him. In the end, he didn't. Pushing off, Sephiroth leapt from the helicopter. The wind whistled up around him, streaming through his hair and yanking at his coat as the ground rushed up to meet him. He landed, knees bending to take the shock that jolted through him, and automatically angling Masamune to keep the long blade from scoring the ground. Straightening from his partial crouch, Sephiroth reached up and ran his hand through his tousled hair, tucking a few errant strands behind his ears and out of his way. He glanced aside as Cloud touched down nearby, landing with one hand braced on the ground and his longsword angled aside. Sephiroth turned and looked up as the helicopter banked and turned back towards Midgar. He remained that way, motionless, until it was little more than a fading black spot on the horizon. The further away it got, the more he could feel his shoulders relaxing. Inhaling, Sephiroth closed his eyes for a moment and allowed himself to savor the feel of being far enough from Midgar that it didn't blight his view. The sound of a boot scuffing lightly at the dirt drew his attention, and Sephiroth looked back over his shoulder to see Cloud glancing surreptitiously around. Masamune's tip skimmed over the top of the grass as Sephiroth strode toward, and then a few steps past him. He paused there once more. "The objective is beyond that stand of trees." "Yes, sir." The reply was, once again, just short of being too quiet. Without further comment, Sephiroth strode towards the nearby corpse. He could already hear the sounds of the monsters beyond, the sound of pawing, the occasional bestial grunt and grumble. The large gathering of beasts he knew awaited them came into view as he skirted the edge of the trees. A herd of jewel horns, each and every one of them with their thick, blood-red hide and gaping maws. Sephiroth came to a halt once more, as did the quiet steps following him, heralded only by a quiet inhalation. Sweeping his eyes over the herd, Sephiroth did a quick tally before saying, "We're to drive them away or kill them." Calm wasn't far from here, and the beasts had already destroyed one small, isolated homestead. Normally, the jewel horns didn't gather in such large groups. In fact, they were often solitary. The challenge of wiping out such a gathering was already curling through him. Instead of proceeding, Cloud stepped up beside him and faced Sephiroth directly. "What's this about, Sephiroth?" His words were clipped, and there was a wariness about him that waited for Sephiroth's response. Tilting his head down, Sephiroth turned his attention on Cloud almost reluctantly. It was more the use of his name that pulled him from his thoughts than anything, and he blinked slowly in surprise. Shuttering his expression once more, Sephiroth turned his attention back on the shambling monsters. "Do you know," he said slowly, "the strings I had to pull to keep you out of Hojo's hands?" Again. Out the corner of his eye, he caught the look of surprise that flashed across Cloud's face. Just the barest of motions, as his eyebrows drew down and his eyes widened. "I didn't know he was involved in second-class promotions." "He isn't," Sephiroth murmured, pressing the tips of his fingers to his forehead as a faint ache bloomed behind his temples. Thinking of Hojo was always a pain one way or another. Soldiers are showered in mako when they enter the program and undergo an operation to finish their enhancements. A special operation designed by Hojo and his team, though it was originally designed by Professor Gast, as were most of Hojo's programs. Turning his head to look at Cloud fully, he added, "However, he's insisting you need to undergo the operation to be truly enhanced." In reality, Sephiroth knew, Hojo likely just wanted Cloud to pick him apart, metaphorically and literally, to find the same things Sephiroth was curious about. What made Cloud's drive tick, and what he was made of. Cloud looked away, staring blankly across the field at the distant herd of monsters, one fist clenching and unclenching at his side. "And he only has one more chance." "Yes, and so I am making efforts to curtail your exemplary performance." Watching him, Sephiroth tightened his hand around Masamune's hilt, momentarily irritated that he was put in this position at all. He really should just kill him and be done with it. Looking away, he said, "As such, I want you to report directly to me for briefing, rather than another second." It wasn't an entirely uncommon practice, though usually it was reserved for particularly sensitive information. Lazard had taken care of all of it before he disappeared, but with Heidegger's new and ham-handed system, Sephiroth had found himself saddled with more of Soldier's day-to-day minutiae than he cared to. At least it gave him ample opportunity to stymie Cloud's rise through the ranks. For a moment, he wished Zack were back, if only so he could shove some of the duties on his only fellow first. It would aid him even further, as Zack knew how to make a report nigh on incomprehensible, while still conveying the necessary information in his own special way. Thinking on it, Sephiroth let himself sigh. He was a little irritated with Zack's leave as well. He blamed him for the fact that he was the only one dealing with this. Unfairly, perhaps, but considering he was dealing with Zack's mentoring duties in a way, he thought he was allowed the pettiness in this case. Not, of course, that it would have stopped him regardless. A sort of amused resignation passed across Cloud's face. Just the slightest upturned quirk of his mouth, coupled with a half-littered expression as he murmured, "Understood." A beat later, his eyes slid over to Sephiroth as he added belatedly, "Sir." Giving it another short pause, Sephiroth smiled slightly as well. "Insubordination again.